Hello, my name is Ben Stimson. I'm a Kitchener area therapist. I go by he, they, them pronouns, and I'm non-binary. So when thinking about my own personal story, it's been quite an odyssey. I'm 35 years old as of the taping of this, and I'm originally from the UK. And so I came to Canada when I was about 9 years old. I was born in a little place called St Asaph in North Wales. And I've always felt, because of that experience, kind of in between, outside of the norm. You know, when I was born, I was diagnosed with or at least a few years later, I was diagnosed with a neurological condition called dyspraxia. And so I went through extensive speech therapy to be able to learn how to speak. Dyspraxia often comes across as clumsiness. For me, and it's a motor control issue, for me it was the fine motor control in my mouth. So I couldn't speak. I completely understood English, but I had to learn how to use each individual muscle in my mouth. Dyspraxia also has a connection to neurodivergency, and so I've always thought differently from others. I've always felt outside the norm because of that, and when I came to Canada, I was suddenly British. Back home, I was just Ben, but when I came to Canada, suddenly I was different, and that difference continued to unfold throughout my life. We moved to a small rural town in Ontario here. We moved to Hanover, Ontario. Everybody was related to each other. I was related to nobody. I started to develop an understanding that I was gay when I was about 10, 11. I was quite young, and I finally came out when I was 15. So suddenly I was a gay British kid with a lisp in the middle of Hanover, Ontario. And so I was very different from many of my peers. I started to see myself a little differently as well. I explored alternative spiritualities because I didn't really connect with the Christianity of that time. The message I was getting was very much that the church, all 18 of them in Hanover, would not accept me for who I was. And I went on a personal odyssey. For many years, I didn't know who I was, and even now I'm still finding huge pieces about myself. In December of last year, after a particularly powerful retreat I went on, suddenly I accepted for myself that I was neurodivergent. I understood that I thought differently from others, and I understood that I probably have ADHD as well. And then I started to realize that I was non-binary. So for me, I feel like the connection between gender and sexuality was always a taken for granted thing. Because I presented as a male, and because I was attracted to males, therefore I had to be a gay male, right? When I started to understand that gender was very different from sexuality, it caused a lot of confusion for me. For a long time in my life, I actually hated being called a man. When I started to get up there in age, so I came out when I was 15, but when I was in my 20s, I hated being called a man because I didn't identify with that kind of masculine image inside my head. And I certainly didn't present as that. But I also knew I wasn't a woman either. I didn't feel connected to femininity in that way. And so for me, I just took for granted I was a gay man who was kind of outside of that, those gender roles. And then I started to really resent those individuals who were outside of that norm. But I was also very secretly very interested as well, curious. I've always felt very connected to the trans experience. I've always felt more comfortable with trans people than I have with cisgender individuals. And I mean, I don't want to say that I dislike or that I feel uncomfortable around, gay men, because obviously the majority of my dating experience has been with gay men. But there was something in that being outside of those gender roles and those gender expectations that society was saying was normal, that felt comfortable for me. And because so much of my personal story has been being outside of where I found myself, I felt like it was a very natural thing. And so I had a lot of trans friends. I had amazing experiences where some of those friends would open up about their journey and their experience, and I saw myself in that experience. But I always felt guilty because I was identifying as a cisgender male. I suppose the turning point for me was with my spirituality, really connecting with a non-gendered approach to spirituality. I had been exploring Wicca and paganism for a long time, which has very strong gendered roles. There's a female goddess and a male god, and the emphasis is always on the female goddess. So where do I fit in that? If I don't feel connected to this hetero masculine deity, where do I fit into that if I don't identify as a woman? And so I really began to listen to those voices in the spiritual communities I belong to, and other communities of third gender, of the energetics of gender, and how that shows up for people who are both connected to a binary and also connected to this other, this nebulous sense of other. And as I listened to the stories more, I started to see myself in that. And it's an exploration to define myself. And I feel like that has been a journey throughout my life of learning to define myself, as opposed to accepting the definitions from other people. I've only identified openly as non-binary since December, so we're filming this in beginning of February, so it's been quite a short time. But I feel like I've known for a lot longer than that. When I decided to come out, it was actually a comfortable experience. Over the past couple of years, I've really been reconnecting with the queer community. I've been exploring what does the queer community mean to me? Because when I was in Toronto for school 10 plus years ago, I never really felt comfortable on Church Street. I never felt comfortable in the gay community there. I didn't see myself represented in it. I certainly didn't see myself represented in club life. And so I've been connecting with what does a queer community mean for me now. I'm very lucky, privileged in many ways, because my life is quite queer-centric. I go to a queer barber. I work at a bookstore that has a majority of the staff are queer in some way. And in my therapy work, I work mostly with queer clients. And so my experience the past couple of years has been shifted from being outside of a community of any sort to suddenly being in the community. And it's really been a change within the pandemic. And so I decided that I was going to come out in December, and I actually haven't had any issues so far. Every so often I feel like the shoe is about to drop. But I will say this, I chose specifically not to come out to my own family yet. And I'm still working through that. Filming this is a part of that process. Not because I feel I'll be marginalized, or I'll be somehow put down by them. I've already been through a coming out experience as a gay man when I was 15 years old in the middle of a town of 8,000 with 18 different churches that all of them were praying for me when I came out. It was a big deal in my small town. But it's about understanding what gender means for me in that context and trying to then explain that to to family members, especially my parents, who grew up in a culture where there were very specific gender roles. My parents were born in the late 40s in the UK, in the north of the UK, in northern England, and so they came from a culture that was very, men are supposed to be this, women are supposed to be this. And so trying to just understand in terms of explaining. But when it came to coming out to the community, I received so many affirmations. Quite a few of my trans friends connected with me and said they knew something. They knew that there was something about me that they felt comfortable with, that there was a camaraderie with. I remember a friend down in the States who came out as non-binary early last year, and has been going through a process of changing their name and finding a name that fits them and who they are now. And I kept asking them, why do you need to change your name so much? Asking them loads of questions, and then I finally realized that those questions were really for me. And when I came back and I apologized to them for really asking sometimes very inappropriate questions, they said, no, I kind of figured that something was going on for you, and I was happy to indulge. With the little bookstore I work at, when I came out to one of my trans co-workers there, they said, oh, that's, well, so funny. It does make total sense to me, because for the first month, especially with the mask on, I actually thought you were a trans man. And when I heard that, I was like, oh, of course. I'm not claiming trans identity there, but it just, that recognition was huge, and that was the most supportive thing I could find. I feel like the more that non-binary and trans characters have become normalized and represented not as the kind of the dead trans prostitute trope on television, we're seeing a lot more strong, independent characters, Steven Universe, for example, or the character Che on the Sex and the City sequel. We're seeing more diverse representation of gender expression on television, and for me that was a huge deal. Steven Universe specifically, which is an amazing television show about a kid who grows up as part alien and part human in a family that is non-traditional, but the love is completely there of aliens who are androgynous but present as in female representation, was big. That really helped to shift me to understanding kind of the non-delineated ways that queerdom can be. I actually changed from identifying as gay about 5 years ago to embracing a word that for me culturally was a slur, and that's queer. I identify as queer, and queer for me really encapsulates that, that otherness, that sense of non-rigidity, that fluidity, and that ability to define myself, because queer is strange, and strange is powerful. So when thinking about that word queer and how it relates to my life and my day-to-day, again, I feel very privileged that I live in a very queer-centric kind of life. This is the life that I've chosen for myself. In many ways, I just live a normal life, I still wash my dishes, I still pick up my cat's barf when she barfs on the floor, I still go and get coffee when I know I don't have enough money for the coffee, but I still do it. But I feel like I'm now living more in my centered place, and that's, I use this a lot with my clients, coming back to that place of center. Queerdom and queer identity is a part of my identity, but it is intersected by all of my other identities, my spiritual identity, my sexual identity, definitely, my kind of boring identity of, everyday living. And so I don't see myself as needing anymore to be performing my identity as I did when I was much younger. When I was much younger, when I moved to Toronto. So when I moved to Toronto in the very early 2000s, and I always wanted to go to a big city like Toronto because at that time, the only representation was Queer as Folk, the L Word, or Will and Grace, right? So for me, Toronto, because it's filmed there, I had this wonderful idea that was what my gay life was going to be like. And I got down there and I hated clubbing. And so then suddenly it was, okay, well, how am I a gay person if I don't like clubbing, right? And I feel like a lot of people, as they begin to develop a sense of their identity, in any identity, right? We see this when people change religions, when people change or affirm genders, or when people affirm kind of, political stance. I mean, the people that we see protesting right now, for example, very performative. But in that performative nature, there's a sense of finding oneself and finding one's normal self in that. So it's normalization. So for me, I went from, and I have to admit it, I took on a gay lisp when I was a teenager and I moved to Toronto the first time. Oh my God, And I realized that what that was I wanted to be recognized. I wanted to be seen by other gay people as a member of their group, right? And because I grew up in so many outsider positions in so many different parts of my life, it's the same whenever I meet a British person. When I meet a British person in Canada, my accent comes out like whiplash, and suddenly I'm emulating, even if that's not my accent. If they come from the South, I'm suddenly emulating that accent because I want to be seen. And I think that's what a lot of people want, is they want to be seen. And especially for non-binary gender identity, what does that look like? What is that exactly? And for me, I've been experimenting with that. I went and got my nails done a few weeks ago, and I've been very conscious of how walking around with purple fingernails is representing and showing myself. And how do I feel wearing nail polish? How do I feel if I'm wearing a certain garment that is more neutral? How do I feel when I talk about myself and present myself? How do I feel when I refer to myself as they and them? And so when it comes to being queer in the world and being queer in my life right now, that is a constant exploration, and I feel a lot of people have a similar journey in many parts of their lives. I mean, I'm only 35. I often feel like I'm much older, and especially because I work and a lot of my social circle are in their 20s. I have to remind myself of how young I actually am. 35 is quite young still. And to come to this place in my life now, I feel very optimistic about the future. My practice, a lot of my work is gearing towards working within the queer community specifically. I feel optimistic, but I'm curious. I'm generally curious who I'll be in the next 10 years. I went through a period in my life where I hated myself, and for that period of my life, I couldn't think of him, of that person I was, because all I saw was somebody who was deeply unhappy, somebody who didn't know themselves, somebody who was making mistakes through left, right, and center. And the turning point for that was when I started to see myself taking ownership of my life now. This was a few years ago, but I was taking ownership of my life in a way that I hadn't been doing. And in that process, I latched on to, if I can be proud of myself from just 5 years before, then maybe the person I'm becoming in 5 years' time can be proud of who I am now. And when I started to work so that I, in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, could be proud of the person I am now, I started to love myself more. And I could see that person I was, that young person I was, needed a hug, needed things, needed support. And so I give myself the support, and I find myself the support I need now, so that in 10 years' time I can be proud of who I am now. oftentimes people, and I see this as my work as a counselor, as my work on myself and friends, people often imagine a better future for themselves, but they get lost along the way. It's like the grass is greener on the other side, but there's no action to put that into action, right? There's no, the fantasy is a lot better than necessarily steps to get there. I would say that it is wise to understand the moment so that you can make plans for the next moment. People often will switch and want to get to the end destination. And so my advice is one step at a time, especially those of you who are on a journey of self-exploration, identity exploration. Take stock of who you are now so that the person you're becoming is built on that solid foundation.